The city skyline glistened in the late afternoon sun, its towering buildings casting long shadows over the streets. Inside the penthouse overlooking Central Park, Charlotte Sullivan stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the world below. The room was meticulously designed, every detail reflecting the wealth and power of the Sullivan family. The sleek furniture, the glass sculptures, the delicate art pieces, all perfectly in place, just like her life had once seemed. She adjusted the emerald silk gown that clung to her figure. It was custom-made, hand-picked by the best designers in the country. It was the kind of dress meant to turn heads, to signal success. But today, the fabric felt like it was suffocating her. She caught her reflection in the mirror, eyes scanning over the years of memories this home held. The scent of fresh flowers in the air mingled with the bitterness she felt deep in her chest. It had been a lifetime since she first met Jonathan Sullivan, the man who had swept her off her feet with his ambition, his charm, and his promise of a life that no one could ever dream of. She had been his quiet anchor, his perfect corporate wife. Together, they had built a dynasty, one that now stretched across industries, from real estate to luxury hotels, from finance to media. The Sullivans were untouchable, the golden couple of New York's elite. Or at least, that's what they had appeared to be. But now, she stood on the precipice of a truth she had long denied. Jonathan had changed. The late nights at the office had become more frequent. The hushed conversations in the study, the once innocent flirtations, had transformed into something darker, something more dangerous. Charlotte wasn't blind. She had seen the signs, the distant glances, the late phone calls, the cold touch in their shared bed. She had tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that it was just a phase. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The invitation to tonight's event sat on the glossy marble table, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. It was embossed with gold leaf, an elegant statement of wealth and prestige. The Sullivans invite you to celebrate their 5-year anniversary at the Montague Grand Hall. 5 years. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of what was supposed to be the perfect union. But the truth had long begun to fray at the edges. Tonight, her husband had promised a grand spectacle, a celebration that would silence the whispers that had started to circle their inner circle. The rumors about Jonathan's affair's betrayal had reached a fever pitch. The last thing he wanted was for people to start asking questions, for cracks to show in the polished facade of their marriage. And so, they were throwing the grandest party New York had ever seen. A performance, as he liked to call it. A way to quiet the gossip, to reassert control over the narrative. Charlotte took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't going to let him see her falter. She would wear the smile of a wife who had it all together, who had everything she could ever want. She would play her part, just as she always had. After all, she had spent years building this life with him. He had given her the world. Wealth, status, luxury. But at what cost? She walked over to the vanity and grabbed the necklace he had given her on their wedding day. It was the same necklace she had worn every day since, a simple platinum chain with a small diamond pendant. It was a token of his love, or so she had once thought. She adjusted it around her neck, the cool metal against her skin. A faint knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She turned, expecting the familiar face of her assistant. But instead, the door opened to reveal Jonathan himself. He stood in the doorway, dressed in a sleek tuxedo, his face a mask of confidence. "Charlotte," he said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "You look stunning." She met his gaze in the mirror, taking the sight of him, handsome, polished, every inch the man everyone admired. But there was something different about him tonight. A coldness in his eyes, a guardedness that sent a chill through her. She forced a smile, her gaze never leaving the reflection in the mirror. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "Ready for the big night?" "Always," he said, stepping closer. His presence filled the room, his cologne heavy in the air. He placed a hand on her shoulder, the touch cold, distant. Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. She had spent years living in the shadows of this man, loving him with all her heart. But now, all she could feel was the emptiness between them, the space that had grown ever wider with each passing day. "Are we?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "Are we really okay, Jonathan?" He hesitated, his hand falling from her shoulder as he looked away. "Of course we are," he said quickly, too quickly. "Why wouldn't we be? Everything's fine." But Charlotte saw it, the flicker of guilt in his eyes, the way his gaze darted away from hers. She had seen that look before, but this time it was different. This time it was real. "I'll be downstairs," he said, his tone clipped. "We'll talk later, Charlotte." He left the room, closing the door behind him. She stood in front of the mirror for a long time, her reflection staring back at her, the weight of the evening ahead bearing down on her shoulders. Tonight wasn't just about saving face. It was about something much bigger. As the elevator descended to the lobby, Charlotte's thoughts turned cold. The man she had married had betrayed her. But what he didn't know was that the woman standing in front of the mirror, the woman he had thought broken, was about to reclaim everything he had taken from her. And tonight, she would make sure he knew exactly who had the power in their marriage. The Monty Grand Hall stood as a beacon of wealth and status, nestled between towering glass skyscrapers that lined the heart of Manhattan. The building shimmered under the lights, a testament to the elite class that had always thrived in the city's core. The air was thick with anticipation, the hum of chatter from the guests reaching crescendo as the event of the year began to take shape. Charlotte stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the polished marble of the entrance. She was no longer the uncertain wife in the mirror. Tonight, she was a woman on a mission. Her sapphire gown sparkled under the floodlights, a jewel amidst the glittering crowd. She kept her head high, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The world around her was alive with color and movement, yet she felt like a ghost, moving in and out of the scene without truly being seen. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was as extravagant as the building itself. The towering crystal chandeliers gleamed, casting a soft glow of a sea of well-dressed men and women who filled the room. Waiters weaved between clusters of guests, offering champagne flutes and trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres. The string quartet played in the background, but its melody seemed distant, as if the music itself knew that something dark was about to unfold. Charlotte's eyes scanned the room, and there he was, Jonathan, holding court as always, his wide smile and easy charm on display. He was surrounded by bankers, socialites, and city officials, all eager to be in his presence. But as Charlotte watched him, her gaze hardened. He had become a man she didn't recognize, a man who was behind a mask of confidence and fabricated charm. And then she entered. The room went silent for a split second, the tension palpable. The red dress, the raven black hair cascading down her shoulders in soft waves. The skin-tight fabric clung to every curve, and the slit up the side of the dress, too high, too revealing, made her presence undeniable. Isabella Rossi. Charlotte's pulse quickened as she watched the woman move through the crowd like a predator, each step an assertion of power. She could feel the air grow colder, the whispers that rippled to the crowd as Isabella made her way toward Jonathan. There was no mistaking the power she held over him. Jonathan's expression faltered for a brief moment, a look of genuine panic flashing in his eyes before he regained his composure. His voice shook slightly as he greeted Isabella with the same warmth he reserved for his most powerful contacts. "Isabella, what are you doing here?" His words barely registered over the hum of the room, but Charlotte heard them, her gut tightening. "Oh, Jonathan," Isabella purred, ignoring Charlotte entirely as if she were invisible. "You didn't think I'd let you celebrate without me, did you?" Charlotte's fingers tightened around the glass of champagne she held. She could feel the eyes of the guests on her, their glances darting between her and Isabella, their curiosity naked and raw. The whispers began again, but this time they weren't about her. They were about her. The mistress, the one who had come to stake her claim in front of them all. Charlotte felt her heart race, but she refused to show any weakness. She had never been a woman to let others see her pain, and she wasn't about to start now. But beneath the practiced smile, beneath the steely exterior, something was changing inside her. She wasn't going to be a passive player in this game. No, this was her moment. "Marcus, darling," Isabella said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, her hand landing on Jonathan's chest. Charlotte clenched her jaw, watching as Jonathan froze, a flicker of shame flashing across his face. "I couldn't bear the thought of you celebrating without me." It was then that the full weight of the situation hit Charlotte. This was no longer just a public affair. It was a spectacle, a performance orchestrated by Jonathan's own hand. Isabella wasn't just here for attention. She was here to stake her claim, to humiliate Charlotte in front of the people who once saw her as the epitome of grace and power. But what Isabella didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Charlotte had already made her move. The final act of this performance was yet to come. As the minutes ticked by, Charlotte stayed calm. Her smile remained in place, but inside, the wheels of her plan were turning. She'd had enough. Jonathan thought he could have it all, that he could play both sides and come out unscathed. He was wrong. The final piece of her plan was already in motion. As the night wore on and the champagne flowed freely, Charlotte made her way toward the back of the hall, where a small private lounge had been set aside for family and select guests. She was met by Victor Ashford, the head of her family's private equity firm, who greeted her with a knowing look. He had been expecting her. "It's all set," he whispered. "The venue's under your control, Charlotte. As soon as the paperwork is signed, it's yours." Charlotte nodded, her eyes scanning the crowd, her mind already several steps ahead. By the time the night ended, Jonathan and Isabella would learn a painful lesson. They thought they were in control. They thought they could humiliate her without consequence. But what they didn't know was that Charlotte Sullivan had something far more powerful than their petty games. She had power, and she wasn't afraid to use it. The night had descended upon the Montague Grand Hall, and with it, the atmosphere thickened with tension. The chatter grew louder, the laughter more forced, and the clinking of glasses was no longer accompanied by the light-hearted conversations that had once marked the party. No, this was a gathering of secrets, of unspoken truths that hung heavily in the air like an invisible storm cloud, waiting to burst. Charlotte stood at the back of the hall, watching the scene unfold with an almost detached calm. Her heart raced with anticipation as the final act approached. Isabella, still basking in the attention she so clearly craved, had returned to Jonathan's side. The two of them, united in their conquest, made a striking picture of defiance against Charlotte's composed solitude. Victor Ashford, standing beside her, was a silent sentinel, his businesslike demeanor betraying the weight of the moment. Charlotte had always known that when the time came, she would rely on her family to handle the business side of things. Her father, Arthur Sullivan, had made it clear that the family's power was not just in its wealth. It was in its ability to control, to shape, to move the chess pieces that others didn't even know existed. "You know what to do," Charlotte said softly, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even her. She wasn't just the wife of the billionaire anymore. She was the architect of her own fate. Victor nodded, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the crowd. "As soon as the papers are signed, the venue is yours. We secured it under the pretext of a purchase. The deal will go through, Charlotte. They'll have no idea what hit them." Charlotte's eyes flicked toward Jonathan and Isabella, still lost in their world of whispered secrets and mutual triumph. The truth was, this night was never really about the celebration. It was about power. And now, Charlotte was about to seize it. The moment arrived when Charlotte, with a final nod to Victor, began her calculated walk to the front of the room. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, her sapphire gown trailing behind her like a wave of silk. The room seemed to hold its breath as she made her way through the crowd, her path deliberate, unwavering. As she reached the center of the hall, all eyes turned to her. The whispers paused. The music slowed. Even the waiters seemed to stop in their tracks. Charlotte had made her move. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice cool and composed, carrying the weight of someone who had long since stopped fearing the judgment of others. "I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. It's been a long time since we've gathered here, and tonight's purpose is not just to celebrate, but to mark the beginning of something new." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. Isabella's eyes flickered with confusion, while Jonathan's expression tightened. Neither of them had expected this. "I'm sure many of you have heard the rumors," Charlotte continued, her voice gaining strength with every syllable, "that my marriage to Jonathan has been on the rocks, that I've been the quiet, neglected wife while he played in the spotlight. You've heard whispers about infidelity, betrayal, and deception." She let her gaze sweep over the room, noting the mix of curiosity, judgment, and unease in the eyes of the guests. They were all here to witness a spectacle, a performance. But this wasn't the act they had been expecting. "Well, the rumors are true," Charlotte said, her voice calm and clear. "But what they don't know is that I'm no longer the woman I was when I walked into this room. I've been building something far bigger than any of you can imagine. And tonight, you will all witness the fruits of that labor." The gasp started almost immediately. Charlotte could feel the shift in the room, the disbelief spreading like wildfire. But it was too late for anyone to stop what was about to happen. "I'd like to introduce you all to the newest owners of this venue," she said, her voice never wavering. "And by owners, I mean me." She raised her hand, signaling Victor, who stepped forward, his demeanor as cold and calculating as ever. From his briefcase, Victor pulled out a folder and handed it to the manager of the venue, who looked equally stunned and confused. "Mr. Du Bois," Victor said with a nod, "please read the contents of the document and confirm that the purchase agreement has been finalized." Du Bois's eyes widened as he skimmed through the papers. "Tietes, this can't be. You're saying you've already secured the Montague." Charlotte smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. "Yes, Mr. Du Bois. The entire venue, the property, everything, effective immediately. Consider this party a celebration of a new chapter." Isabella stood frozen, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. Jonathan's face had drained of color. The realization was dawning on him. His empire, his carefully crafted image, was beginning to crumble. "No," Jonathan stammered, his voice cracking. You can't just take this from me. I still have control here." Charlotte turned to him slowly, her gaze piercing. "You thought you controlled everything, Jonathan. But you forgot one thing. Your empire was never built on power. It was built on illusion. And now that illusion is over." The room was silent as Jonathan tried to recover, but the weight of his downfall was too much. Isabella's triumphant smirk began to fade, replaced by a creeping panic. She was realizing too late that Charlotte had outplayed them both. Victor turned to Charlotte and nodded, signaling that everything was in place. The venue was officially hers. But that wasn't all. "Let's not waste any more time, shall we?" Charlotte said, her voice ringing out. "I think it's time to take the next step in reclaiming what's mine." With that, she turned to the shocked crowd. "I've asked for a small favor tonight, nothing extravagant. Just a little something to mark the beginning of this new chapter. A small gesture of retribution, if you will. Isabella's face twisted in confusion. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising with panic. Charlotte smiled coldly, her next words sealing the fate of everyone in the room. "The name Sullivan is going to be remembered tonight, but not for the reasons you think. This venue is going to be rebranded under a new name. This entire night will be erased from history. And you, Isabella," she said, her gaze locking onto Mistress with a glacial stare, "you'll find that the world doesn't always turn in your favor." Isabella opened her mouth to protest, but the words never came. Her defeat had already been sealed, just as Jonathan's was. And there was nothing they could do to change the narrative now. The night had just begun, but it was already clear Charlotte Sullivan was no longer just a wife. She was a force, one that had turned her pain into power, and she was going to make sure the world knew it. The Monty Grand Hall was no longer a venue of celebration. The opulent chandeliers that once shimmered with light now cast long shadows, and the air that had once been filled with polite chatter and laughter was now thick with sense of uneasy silence. The guests, still reeling from the shock of Charlotte's revelation, began to disperse in hushed groups. Whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd, their faces filled with confusion, disbelief, and in some cases a quiet awe. Charlotte stood at the center of it all, her back straight, her eyes sharp and focused. The powerful, confident woman who had walked into the room earlier in the night had transformed before their very eyes. She wasn't the victim any longer. No, tonight she was the architect of her own fate. Isabella, still standing beside Jonathan, was a picture of fury. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her hands clenched at her sides. She had come here tonight to claim victory, to flaunt her affair in front of the world, to humiliate Charlotte. But now, the tables had turned. The cold realization settled over her, and she finally turned her gaze toward Jonathan, who was standing motionless beside her. His face was a mask of disbelief, his jaw tight with anger and fear. He had never expected Charlotte to do this, to take control in such a public, calculated way. "You can't just do this," Isabella hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "You promised me everything. This was supposed to be our night." Jonathan's eyes met hers, but his expression was distant. The weight of the situation was too much for him to handle, the world crashing in on him. His mind was racing, trying to comprehend what had just unfolded. "Isabella," Jonathan started, his voice weak, but he couldn't finish the sentence. The gravity of the moment hung between them, and Isabella, for the first time, realized that Jonathan wasn't her ally. He had failed her just as much as he had failed Charlotte. Meanwhile, Charlotte remained calm, composed. The wave of power she now held over the room felt almost surreal. She watched Jonathan struggle with quiet detachment. He had played a game of deceit for far too long, and now it was his turn to face the consequences. "Jonathan," Charlotte said softly, her voice cutting through the tense silence. She didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. Every word she spoke carried the weight of authority. "You've made your choice, and now it's time for me to make mine." The words hung in the air, every guest in the room holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Charlotte's gaze flicked over to Victor, who had been waiting for the signal. At a mere glance from her, he nodded and walked toward the stage at the front of the hall, where a small group of well-dressed professionals stood, ready to begin the final phase of Charlotte's plan. "Tonight was about more than just revenge," Charlotte continued, her eyes never leaving Jonathan. "It was about control, about taking back what you thought you could steal. But you've underestimated me, Jonathan. You've underestimated us." She turned her attention to the crowd, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Do you all know what the Sullivan family's true legacy is?" Charlotte asked, her voice unwavering. It's not just about the businesses or the properties we own. It's about power. Quiet, unyielding power. The kind that makes people tremble without them even realizing it. She smiled coldly, the satisfaction of knowing she had one burning brightly in her chest. Jonathan, meanwhile, could feel the walls closing in on him. The weight of his actions, a betrayal, and the wreckage of his reputation were too much to bear. The security he relied on for so long, his wealth, his connections, was crumbling piece by piece. He looked at Charlotte, then at Isabella, but the shame was evident in his eyes. He had lost everything. His wife, his lover, his empire. There was no escaping the fallout now. As Charlotte's plan came to fruition, the guests were left in stunned silence, their attention fixated on the unfolding spectacle. The Vance family, quiet and reserved as always, stood at the center of it all, watching with approving eyes. Arthur Vance, Charlotte's father, stood in the corner of the room, his presence commanding the respect of everyone present. He had always been the backbone of the Sullivan family's influence, and now, with his quiet support, Charlotte was proving just how deep that power ran. Victor Ashford had already ensured that all legalities were in place. The venue was officially rebranded under the Vance name, and the paperwork for the takeover had been signed. Charlotte's influence was now undeniable, and anyone who had doubted her strength was forced to acknowledge it. And then came the final move. A hush fell over the crowd as Charlotte took the stage, the last piece of her plan falling into place. With a single, calculated gesture, she signaled for the room to quiet, her eyes scanning the guests one final time. "I want everyone to understand something," she began, her voice calm, yet filled with authority. "You've all seen the spectacle tonight, but let's not confuse drama with real power. This," she gestured to the grand hall around her, "is just the beginning. You may have been entertained, you may have been shocked, but the truth is, I'm just getting started." The crowd was silent, every eye fixed on her. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable next move. "I will not be defined by betrayal, nor by the mistakes of those around me," Charlotte continued, her gaze unwavering. "The Sullivan name, and now the Vance name, is synonymous with strength. And if anyone here thinks for a second that they can use my pain as a weapon against me, they'll soon realize that I've turned it into my greatest asset." The words were like a dagger to Jonathan's heart. He knew that he had lost not just his wife, but his entire place in this world. And there was no escape from the power Charlotte had just unleashed. The evening ended with the sound of 1,000 whispers, but it wasn't Charlotte who had lost. It was Jonathan. It was Isabella, and it was anyone who had doubted her. Charlotte Sullivan wasn't just the wife of a billionaire anymore. She had become a force unto herself. And now, her empire was one that no one could touch. The following week passed in a blur of meetings, legal battles, and a relentless wave of media coverage. News outlets buzzed with the fallout from the Montague Grand Hall event. Billionaire's wife reclaims power. Sullivan family takes over venue amid public scandal. Headlines were a mix of admiration, disbelief, and for some, a sense of quiet awe. But for Charlotte, the real work was just beginning. In the quiet of her office in the Vance family building, she sat behind the polished mahogany desk, her eyes scanning through the stack of papers in front of her. She had never expected to be here, in this position of total power, but she had embraced it fully. The legal documents were a mere formality. She had already ensured that every business, every property Jonathan had built was now under her control. Victor Ashford stood at her side, his expression unreadable as always. He was the one who had handled the logistics, the one who had sealed the deal. But now, it was Charlotte who was calling the shots. "Is everything in order?" she asked, not looking up from her papers. Victor nodded. "The takeover is complete. The assets are all transferred. And the media spin is, Exactly what we anticipated. Your control over the venue is secure. The new brand identity is already being rolled out. Charlotte's lips curved into a thin smile. Good. I want no trace of what came before. This is our venue now, and anyone who's been involved with Marcus or Isabella needs to feel the weight of that. She closed the file in front of her and leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the window. From here, she could see the towering skyline of New York, her city, her family city, her empire. Victor spoke again, his tone more serious now. I've also had some interesting developments regarding Marcus and Isabella. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. Her curiosity piqued. What developments? They've been practically living in isolation since the incident. Marcus is scrambling to rebuild his reputation, but every step he takes seems to push him further into the ground. The SEC investigation into his firm is turning up more dirt than expected. His clients are abandoning him. Even his most loyal investors are pulling out. Charlotte's lips tightened. He'll never recover from this. And Isabella? Victor's expression darkened. She's been spending lavishly, thinking she can escape the fallout, but she's facing mounting debt. The lease on that diamond ring she flaunted? It's coming up for renewal next week. She won't be able to afford it. Charlotte's fingers drummed lightly on the desk, her mind working. She had been patient, too patient, but the time for waiting was over. She was going to deliver the final blow, the one that would make sure Marcus and Isabella would never again see the light of day in New York's elite circles. Good, she said quietly. We'll make sure they understand that there's no going back from this. Later that evening, Charlotte stood in front of a mirror in her penthouse, adjusting the diamond necklace her father had given her. It was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of everything she had fought for, everything she had taken back from those who thought they could destroy her. The thought of Marcus and Isabella still simmered in her mind, but the anger was no longer consuming her. It had been replaced by a cold, strategic focus. They had tried to take everything from her, but she was taking it all back. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. As she turned toward the door, ready to step out into the night, her phone buzzed on the marble countertop. A text message from Victor. It's done. Marcus and Isabella just signed the final settlement papers. It's official. They're out. A surge of satisfaction washed over Charlotte. It was over. The final pieces were in place. There was no going back now. But then, just as she was about to leave, another message flashed on her screen. It was from her brother, Julian Vance. Meet me at the Vance Tower. We need to talk. Urgent. She paused. Julian rarely called for meetings unless it was important. And if it was urgent, it meant something had shifted. Something big. At the Vance Tower, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Charlotte stepped into the private floor that had once been her father's office. It was now hers, and the space had been reconfigured to fit her vision. The windows overlooked the city in the same sweeping way they always had, but now everything felt different. It felt like Charlotte was truly in control. Julian was already there, standing by the large conference table, his arms crossed as he watched the city below. Julian, Charlotte greeted him, her voice cool. What's this about? Julian didn't immediately answer. He just motioned for her to sit down. The tension between them was palpable, and Charlotte could feel in the air as she took her seat. Something's off. Julian finally said, his voice low. We've been tracking the media's coverage of Marcus, Isabella, and even you. It's too perfect. Too clean. Charlotte frowned. Not following? What do you mean? I'm saying there's a lot of attention on us right now, and it's not all from the right places. I'm hearing rumors. Powerful people are getting interested in the Vance family in ways we didn't expect. Charlotte's brow furrowed. What kind of rumors? Julian leaned forward, his tone now serious. People are starting to notice that we're not just in the game of wealth. We're in the game of power. And some of them think we're growing too fast, too quickly. We're attracting the wrong kind of attention. Charlotte's mind raced as she processed his words. This was her moment. This was her empire. But she was being warned that others were watching. But instead of fear, she felt something else. Excitement. If they think we're too big to fail, Charlotte said slowly, her voice almost a whisper, then they're in for a rude awakening. Julian didn't respond right away, but there was a glint of something, respect, maybe, behind his eyes. I'm with you, he said, but we need to be careful. There's more at stake now. Charlotte nodded, her gaze hardening. I've never been more careful in my life. Now, let's make sure Marcus and Isabella never rise from the ashes of their own downfall. As she left the Vance Tower, the weight of the night's conversation hung over Charlotte. There were forces beyond her control now, forces that saw her power as a threat, but she wasn't afraid. In fact, it only made her more dangerous. The game had changed, and Charlotte Sullivan was no longer just playing it. She was rewriting the rules. The skyline of New York glimmered beneath the vast stretch of night as Charlotte Sullivan gazed out of her penthouse window. The lights below twinkled like stars, each one representing a decision she had made, a calculated move in the grand game she had been playing for years. The city, once a backdrop to her family's empire, now felt like a stage for her personal triumph. The events of the past week had been nothing short of a whirlwind. Jonathan and Isabella's fall from grace had been swift, almost cinematic in its brutality. Their names, once synonymous with power and luxury, were now whispered in shameful tones. But Charlotte wasn't done. Not yet. She turned away from the window, her mind sharp and focused. The final pieces of her plan were in motion. The Vance family's takeover of the Montague Grand Hall had been just the beginning. There was more at stake now. Bigger plays, larger moves, and a legacy that would echo long after she was gone. Her phone buzzed on the desk, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Victor. It's done. The takeover bid for Sovereign Hospitality is in the final stages. The board will be meeting tomorrow morning. They won't refuse us. This is ours. Charlotte smiled. The culmination of years of preparation, of quiet power building, was now coming to fruition. Sovereign Hospitality was just one of the many pieces of her expanding empire. Once it was hers, there would be nothing left for Marcus, nothing for Isabella, and no one who could challenge the Vance legacy. Later that evening, as the city bustled below, Charlotte made her way to the private club her family had owned for decades. The club had been a sanctuary for the city's elite, a place where decisions were made in quiet, dimly lit corners of its luxurious rooms. Tonight, it was where she would take her final step toward complete control. Julian was already there, his face etched with the same determination that had become so familiar to Charlotte in the past few days. He had always been her rock, the one who never wavered, even when the rest of the world questioned their methods. Everything's in place? Charlotte asked, her voice steady. Julian nodded, his gaze never leaving the glowing city outside. It's all coming together. But you should know, there are whispers. Powerful people are starting to take notice. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. She had expected this. Power was never given without resistance. She had already anticipated the backlash, the challenges that would come, but she was ready for it, ready to use every piece of leverage she had. They're afraid, Charlotte said, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. They should be. The next morning, Charlotte sat at her office at the Vance Tower, surrounded by the final details of the Sovereign Hospitality acquisition. As she went over the documents, the weight of what she was about to accomplish sank in. She wasn't just taking over an empire. She was reshaping the narrative, turning her family's quiet legacy into a force that would dominate for generations. Victor entered the room, a rare flicker of excitement in his usually calm demeanor. It's official. The deal is closed. Sovereign is ours. Charlotte stood, her gaze fixed on the horizon outside. She could feel the city humming beneath her, the power she had built becoming something palpable, something unstoppable. "Good," she said, her voice filled with cold satisfaction. "But this isn't just about business. This is about making sure everyone understands the cost of crossing me." Later that evening, at a press conference held at the newly acquired Monteith Grand Hall, Charlotte stepped in front of the cameras. The room was packed with reporters, financial analysts, and socialites. They were all here to witness the rise of the most powerful woman in the city. The flashing cameras and the sound of questions faded into the background as Charlotte took the podium. She had been prepared for this moment, but the reality of it still sent a ripple of exhilaration through her. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear and confident, each word cutting through the noise like a sharp blade. "I stand before you today not as the wife of Jonathan Sullivan, but as Charlotte Vance, head of the Vance family, owner of sovereign hospitality, and a woman who knows the price of power." She paused, allowing her words to settle. The room was silent, every person hanging on her every word. "For years, my family's legacy was one of quiet influence. But today, we step into the light. Today, we take what's ours, and we make sure the world knows it." The reporters exchanged glances, the magnitude of her statement sinking in. Charlotte wasn't just making a financial move. She was claiming a new era. "As for my personal life," Charlotte continued, her tone never wavering, "I've made my peace. Betrayal has a price, and I've paid it. But I will not be defined by the mistakes of others. I will define myself." The room was electric, the air thick with anticipation, the undercurrent of power pulsing through every word she spoke. "To those who thought they could take everything from me," she said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, "I have one thing to say. You never knew who you were dealing with." That night, as the press conference ended and the city lights flickered below, Charlotte Sullivan stood at the helm of something much greater than what Jonathan or Isabella had ever imagined. She had taken everything from them, her dignity, her power, her name, and turned it into something that couldn't be erased. The future was hers now, and there was no one who could stand in her way.